I might have to leave this off.
I need 1 minute before we begin because for some reason my garage is opening and closing. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. I have no idea. Probably my husband.
Okay. Okay. We're gonna admit everyone.
1 minute before we begin because for some reason my garage is opening and closing.
Oh no, she has to leave. Oh.
I have no idea. Probably my husband.
Okay. Okay. We're gonna admit everyone. So whoever has the YouTube, make sure the YouTube is on mute.
I just clicked mute, but I want it, people can still hear it though, right? Okay, thanks.
Right.
Okay.
Admitting everyone?
Okay, let's do it. Admit everyone. I'm just gonna go on and make sure that there's any, see if there's any new registrants.
Hello, everyone. Just gonna say hi.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we've admitted most of the people who are currently in the waiting room.
Mhm.
So we'll just go ahead and get started. So to begin with, thank you so much for attending and for participating. My name is Ashley Williams, and I am a fourth year PhD student here at Auburn University, and I'm also the chair of the OurSTEMstory subcommittee for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at Auburn University in the Department of Biological Sciences. Today, we have a Holocaust survivor by the name of Endre Sarkany, and he's going to be providing us with his experience as he experienced going through the Holocaust. But to begin with, just understand that we're using the Zoom platform at the moment because obviously of COVID, but this is just a general overview of our entire series. So first, I'm going to do a little greetings, obviously, and introductions, and I'm going to review the program structure. And then Dr. Rita Grace, who's an associate professor, she's going to give a talk on the road from genetics experiments during the Holocaust to human rights. So I know it's kind of disappointing to know that we couldn't come up with ways to protect human rights and people without having done something utterly abysmal, but we did happen to come up with something positive out of a horrible experience. So she's going to discuss the road from genetics experiments during the Holocaust to human rights, and then we'll have Andy provide us with his experience as a survivor. We'll also then have a Q&A and discussion at 5 p.m. and then we'll have a dismissal at 5:30. So the entire event should take 1 hour and 30 minutes. And if you have any questions, make sure that you direct them in the chat to Dr. Marie Strader. She is the event moderator for this. Before we begin, I'd like to start by providing a little do's and don'ts on Zoom etiquette for this. Please submit your questions in the chat to Marie. And if you have a question, you can use the raise your hand icon to directly speak with the speaker or to just let Marie know in the chat that you'd like to ask a question verbally. If you're viewing on YouTube, you can submit your questions. You can submit your questions on social media using the hashtag OurSTEMstory, and we just would like for everyone to please be respectful. Please do not unmute yourself without any permission, and please do not use any profane or disrespectful language or imagery during this event. And finally, I'd like to go ahead and start by giving a trigger warning that the information that's going to be portrayed will be related to the Holocaust. So if that is a trigger for you, you might want to consider looking at future events, and this one may not be for you. And we understand if that's the case. All right, that said, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Grace.
All right, 1 second here. All right, well, welcome everyone. The first thing that I would like to do is to acknowledge that our university and our city exist on the original homeland of the Muskogee people who were forced off their land in the 1700s and 1800s. So today we're honoring Holocaust Remembrance Day. And on this day, we remember those who were murdered. We recognize and honor the survivors, and we seek to learn from the legacy of the Holocaust. So we're really lucky to have Andy with us today to speak about his experiences and his perspectives as a survivor. One of the goals of our STEM story is to educate current and future scientists and the public on the moments where human rights have been violated in the name of research advancement. So before Andy speaks, I'm going to give a very brief 15-minute talk that outlines the connections between science and specifically genetics, the atrocities that were committed during the Holocaust, and the origins of the ethical codes and laws that protect human rights and the rights of human subjects in research today. So this is a deep and a complicated story, and I'm really only going to be able to scratch the surface. So my goal is to provide a place for you to start learning. So as a Jewish person who's also a geneticist, I'd really love to tell a completely different story today. A more recent one about how the insights from genetics underscore our shared humanity and worth and the need for universal protection for human rights. But that wouldn't be a truthful and honest story, because the truth is that it's the beginnings of genetics as a science that led to a very dangerous idea called eugenics that the Nazis combined with their racist expression of science to promote ideology that led to the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. And it's not until the search for justice in the aftermath that we begin to see the glimmerings of a movement toward universal protection of human rights, and specifically the rights of human participants in research. So to follow this path from the dawn of genetics all the way to human rights, we need a thread. And the thread that I'm going to use is a particular kind of study called a twin study. So twin studies were used by early geneticists to understand human heredity. They were used by Nazi scientists, and they're used today to understand things like the inheritance of hereditary diseases. So because we're going to talk about genetics, you're all going to get a little lesson in genetics. I'm sorry, that's what's happening right now. I'm going to define genetics. I'll tell you about some recent discoveries in the area of epigenetics, and we'll talk about what we can learn from these kinds of twin studies. So genetics is the science that explores genes and genomes and the hereditary characteristics of organisms. And what I mean by characteristics are things like the differences in hair color that we can see here in this very non-random sample of human beings. We can also look at the kind of diversity we see in nature, like the different spots that we see on these ladybugs. So if a particular character that we're interested in is due to variation in the genetic code, which is made up of DNA sequences represented here by these rungs in this twisted ladder, this is the double helix of DNA, we would refer to them as genetic. However, scientists have recently discovered, from a scientific perspective, that there are other changes that actually don't change the genetic code at all, but can affect the way that genes work. So for example, these are chemical modifications like the one shown here, which is the addition of a methyl group to the DNA. And these kinds of epigenetic marks can affect characteristics that we might be interested in as geneticists. So how can that happen? Well, starting from the DNA, you have a lot of DNA inside each of your cells. And that DNA isn't just crammed in there in a giant spaghetti mess. The same way you would like roll up the spaghetti on a fork in order to eat it, your DNA is rolled around proteins called histones in order to provide organization. It can be wound very tightly and takes on this closed configuration, or it can be wound loosely and takes on this open configuration. When it's open, it's accessible to the cellular machinery that's necessary to read the code that makes up a gene. it turns out that these epigenetic marks, like the addition of methyl groups to the DNA, are a signal that governs this organization, in this case leading to a closed configuration where genes are turned off. And that might affect characters that we're interested in, like the fur color in this mouse. Now imagine if there's some environmental event that removes these methyl groups. That would lead to an open configuration, genes would be turned on, and it might affect the character that we're interested in. So this is actually a real example. Here are our two mice. This is our brown mouse, and this is our big, beautiful yellow mouse. They have other differences, like differences in the propensity to develop certain diseases. What scientists have found is that there's actually no difference in the genetic code of the gene involved. The difference is due to an epigenetic mutation. So it's precisely that removal of methyl groups that leads to this phenotype or characteristic of yellow fur. So when scientists first made these kinds of observations, of course, the first thing that they wanted to know were, do these kinds of epigenetic marks affect human beings? And a really powerful way to look at that is to do a twin study. So what's special about twins, specifically identical twins, is that they're derived from the same egg and sperm. And so they have the same genetic sequences. When we compare twins, we can assume that the differences are not genetic, that they're due to something else like the environment or epigenetic marks. And so my favorite example of this that I call twins in space was done by NASA scientists. And what they realized was that two of their astronauts, Scott Kelly and now Senator Mark Kelly, were identical twins. And so what they did was that Senator Mark Kelly stayed here on Earth, and Scott Kelly went up into space for an entire year. And the scientists took samples from both of them, and they measured things like DNA methylation. And so they were able to show that the environment of space did affect a couple of Scott Kelly's genes, one involved in collagen and one involved in chromosome ends. But overall, they learned that he was able to adapt to that environment, but it didn't have concerning long-lasting changes to the way that his genes were. So in general, this kind of research can tell us how our behaviors and the environment that we find ourselves in can cause changes that might affect the way our genes work. One thing I want to say here is that it's really important to realize that it would be entirely illegal for Scott and Mark to be coerced into this study. They had to consent, and they had to consent from an informed viewpoint, which means that they knew exactly what would happen during the experiment. They would be aware of any potential risks, and they would learn about the benefit to humanity before agreeing. So how did we get to this point where we can learn things from these kinds of experiments while still ensuring that there's protection for the participants? To get here, we followed a very dark path, and it begins at the dawn of genetics as a science. So early geneticists were focused on trying to show that the laws of inheritance that Mendel discovered in pea plants also applied in other organisms like humans. And one of the first people to study human heredity, Sir Francis Galton, actually came up with this twin study design, a little bit more complex than the one I showed you, but one that's still used today, so that he could separate genetic influences from environmental ones for the human characteristics that he was interested in. But in the course of his work, his thoughts took a very dangerous turn, and he began to believe that human intelligence was hereditary, and that you could breed people the way that you would breed domestic crops and animals. And to promote his idea, he gave it a name, and he called it eugenics. So eugenics is the idea that you can improve human populations by selecting people that have desirable hereditary traits. When I say that, giant red flags and alarm bells should be going off in your mind, because what does it mean to improve human populations? And who's going to decide what the desirable traits are? So this is a very concerning idea. Sir Francis here looks very worried, and he should be, because his legacy contains both the twin study and the idea of eugenics, which is what leads to the atrocities that were committed during the Holocaust. So the Nazis combined this idea of eugenics with their race science, which was a racist expression of science where they believed that there were biological races, some of which had inferior characteristics and some superior characteristics, and that they could keep their populations pure by removing people who are from the inferior races. This is absolutely false. There's no science in this. It's racist ideology masquerading as science. They combined eugenics with a very specific racist anti-Semitic ideology to develop policies that led to the sterilization of hundreds of thousands of people. And I'll note here that they weren't alone. There were other governments who had sterilization programs in the name of eugenics. They had a policy of dehumanization and propaganda that led to torture, murder, and butchering of people. And this includes human experimentation on prisoners. They murdered 6 million Jewish people and millions of other people, including the Roma, Slavic people, Black people, gay people, people with disabilities, and many more. So the focus of this talk is going to be on the role of science, and we're talking about twin studies. The probably best known example of twin studies that were done by Nazi scientists were done by Mengele. So Mengele committed monstrous acts, and so we'd like to think that he has a monstrous origin story. But the truth is that he was a trained scientist with a standard academic background. He was supported by the scientific institutions of the time in Germany. He had mentors, collaborators, and many others that were complicit in the atrocities that he committed. And he wasn't alone. So there were actually many Nazi biomedical scientists and professionals who committed similar crimes. So he used the idea of race science and eugenics to justify human experimentation on Jews and Roma who were held in Auschwitz. And he decided to use this twin study design. So what would happen is that people would be transported there in cattle cars, and the doors would open and they would be separated into two groups. Those who would be murdered immediately and those who would be kept for a time as prison labor. And Mengele, or people who worked with him, would be there, and they were looking for their perfect human subjects for their experiments, which were identical twins. Now, many of the people that they selected were children. And what he would do is that one twin would be considered as the one receiving the experimental treatment, and the other one would be considered to be the control. And when I say treatment, I mean things that involve torture, maiming, disfigurement. He would inject them with God knows what they didn't know, different kinds of pathogens, drugs. He injected the eyes of children with adrenaline to see if he could change their eye color, for example. And what he would do is, if the treatment resulted in the death of one of the twins, he would also murder their brother or sister so that he could do a post-mortem comparison. So in the aftermath, when the world was forced to confront the fact that these acts had been allowed to happen, people struggled with how you could find justice for these kinds of atrocities. Now, you might say they could put Mengele on trial. Well, Mengele escaped to South America. He was never put on trial. He died in the late 70s of a heart attack while swimming off the coast. And there were also many other biomedical professionals who never actually received any kind of discipline or even issues with their careers, and just went on after these events. So the people that were working during the war crimes trials, and specifically the Nuremberg trials in this case, the lawyers and the judges were bringing to justice some of these biomedical professionals. And what they realized was that a part of that path to justice had to be spelling out the specific ethical principles and the rules that should govern research that involves human subjects in order to protect human life. And so the things that they wrote down are actually called the Nuremberg Code. And perhaps surprisingly, the Nuremberg Code was the first international code of ethics that specified the rules for research on human subjects. And it lays the groundwork for things that came later, like the Belmont Report in the 70s, that give rise to today's laws and standards for ethical conduct of research. It included many of the things that are in our current laws and ethical codes. It includes informed consent, for example, that I talked about when I talked about the NASA twin studies, and many other requirements. For instance, participants not only need to consent, they can pull out at any time for any reason during the course of a study. Now, there's many other things that are included. We've actually been talking about this on our social media. So if you're interested in more details, please go ahead and check that out. So this is the path that we had to take to arrive at widespread protection for human life and well-being of research subjects and others. You might think about it for a bit and ask, why take the risk at all? Maybe there's always some potential risk that you might harm the participants. Do we really need this kind of research that involves human beings, even with our ethical codes and laws? Well, it turns out that there is some research that benefits humanity as a whole, but really can't be done without human participants. And an excellent example are the COVID-19 vaccine trials that show that the vaccines are safe and effective. So where I want to end is that these experiments involve things like informed consent, and they're actually required by law to follow the rules. They can't even happen if they don't show things like benefit to humanity, the fact that it can't be done in any other way, and that they're not going to harm the participants. So these studies are done in an ethical way, and we can feel good about them. And in closing, I'd like to add that it's my opinion that one of the most important things that we learn from this is the importance of ethical principles in protecting human life. And very specifically, I believe that these standards are required for experiments to be scientifically rigorous and informative in a way that benefits humanity as a whole. So they're needed to support the enterprise of science as a whole and ensure that it results in a benefit to humanity. So with that, we're honored to have a chance to meet Endre Sarkany today and to hear about his lived experience as a survivor of the Holocaust. Welcome, Endre. I'm going to turn it over to you. We're really excited to listen and to learn.
Well, thank you very much. And you have heard a scientific presentation. I'm going to tell you a story about a 7-8-year-old boy who's growing up under very difficult times, Nazi occupation of Hungary, then later on Soviet brutality in the country, and had the opportunity to escape and come to the greatest country in the world called the United States of America. So before I will start talking about me, a little bit of the preliminaries. First of all, some geography. So the next slide will tell you a little bit about me personally. So please go there. I was born in Budapest, Hungary on October 31st, 1936. I didn't have a chance to update the slide. I was 84 last October. I escaped Hungary after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Over the last 15 years, I have been speaking generally in public schools, churches, synagogues, public libraries. Over 80 lectures I gave a year. I have been married over 50 years. And just as a note, in this society, this is the same lady. And hopefully we will be able to live for many, many, many more years together. We have 2 children, a daughter and a son, and 5 grandchildren. Now, the next slide will give you a little bit of geography. I like to point out Hungary in a purple circle. It is in Central or Eastern Europe, depends on whom you talk to and refer to. A little bit of more detailed about the surroundings of Hungary. The next slide will give you that information. This map has been taken up from Google, so it is more current than in my time. On the west of Hungary, it is Austria with the capital city of Vienna. The north is a former Czechoslovakia, and just as a note, Slovakia, which is right above Hungary, the majority of the people spoke Hungarian there because at one point that was part of Hungary. When you are moving to the east, a little swivel of Ukraine, and the rest of the east and the southeast is Romania. When you look at the southwest, it is the former Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was broken up into 10 different countries. The closest one to Hungary is Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. Now, let's go back to today's life. The next poem, please go to the slide, which I will read to you, is quite significant to our everyday life. This was written by a German Lutheran minister, Pastor Martin Niemöller, and very clearly say what is our responsibility. It says, first they come for the communists, and I did not object, for I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not object because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the labor leaders, and I did not object because I was not a labor leader. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not object because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to object. It implies that we cannot be a bystander in today's world and just let everything go by. We have to be what I call upstander. We have to fight the rights of people, to the fellow human beings, and speak up all the time when we see something which is inappropriate and some changes need to be made. I have found an additional quotation from related to this by Edmund Burke, which says, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So we do have a major obligation in our society. The next slide will tell you something about you and I, okay? Elie Wiesel in the Book of Night, he quoted, is significant. Whoever listens to a witness, and I am the witness, becomes a witness, and that's you. So we have a close bond during this talk and hopefully afterwards. There is another quotation I have found which is significant. For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. We do have an obligation here too, particularly never forget and never again. The next slide will show you in writing what 6 million Israeli stands for. And the Jews always will say, never again. And of course, never forget. Now let's go a little bit of history. The next slide will tell you that Adolf Hitler came to power in January 30th of 1933. And that was a devastating day, not only for the Jews, for the entire world. He had a vision of creating a pure nation, a superior race. And Dr. Grace actually referred to it before. I call him racial purification policies were integrated into his policies. The major targets were particularly Jews, but Jehovah's Witnesses, the Romans or the Gypsies, Blacks, Slavic people, and all the handicaps. So there were a large number of people whom he wanted to make sure that they all will be exterminated one way or other to purify not only Germany, but the entire world. To me, the Holocaust truly started in 1938 with Kristallnacht, and the next slide will show you that. Okay, Kristallnacht occurred in November 10th, 1938. The word Kristallnacht translates into the night of the broken glass. On these days, practically every Jewish home, synagogues, Jewish institutions were ransacked, destroyed. The Jews were taken off to the streets. They were physically and verbally, brutally hurt. They made them to do pure slave labor with no purpose in life except to humiliate them and show to the rest of the German nation that they don't belong to society. The next slide, I just took it up from Google, which will show you a street in a German street where all the windows were broken in. And then particularly I like to bring to your attention on the right-hand side, the label of a swastika. And I will talk to you about it just a little bit later in my talk. Now, a little bit about the Hungarian government, and let's go to the next slide. Hungary was led by Miklos Horthy. He was the regent or the head of the government. The title admiral came from the old days of the Hungarian Austrian Empire. And he was running the country until 1944. He visited Hitler in Germany, and he agreed and said, we Hungarians going to support all the ideology of the fascist government of Germany, and we will cooperate fully of Hitler's mission. Now, at this point, I'd just like to tell you about my parents. My father was born in Budapest. By the way, Budapest used to be two cities. On the west side of the river Danube, which is going north-south in the country, was Buda, and the east side is Pest. He was born in Pest and grown up there. He had a small construction business, and he worked with his father and with my grandfather. However, my mother is different. She was born in a small village about 8 miles south of the city of Budapest on the east side of the river Danube's bank. The significance of that village was that beside the native tongue of Hungarian, everybody spoke a very distinct and very complicated German dialect called Schwab. Schwabia actually located in the southwest corner of Germany. It was such a difficult dialogue that many average German had difficulty of actually understanding. That particular dialogue actually saved many of us life later on. Now, in 1940, my father was advised by a very good friend of his, and he said, hey, Steve, I really want you to move with your family in a Jewish neighborhood. Budapest had 24 districts, and a 7th district of the city of Budapest was very heavily populated by Jews. It had 2 major synagogues. There was kosher bakeries, butchers, grocery stores, restaurants, accommodating the 85–90% of the population there. There were the various aspects of Judaism were practiced. One of the synagogues was what we call a neolog synagogue or a conservative. The other one was an Orthodox synagogue. Now, the next slide will show you the building that actually I grew up from 1940 to until 1956. The significance of this building, then on the ground floor, you will see the windows representing a nursery kindergarten school. And by the way, it's still a nursery kindergarten school. On the top floor, when you see the large windows, it was representing a dance acrobat and a ballet studio. It was owned by a Jewish family. And this building had a lot of empty spaces in generally speaking. This became eventually an orphanage for over 150 children. And these children ended up here because either the parents felt that where they lived in the periphery of the city of Budapest, brought it in for safekeeping, to making the sacrifice to divorce them from the kids. And some of the children were brought in here who were found just around the countryside that they were abandoned because the Nazis already took their parents away. Hungary had a very strong Nazi party called the Arrow Cross Party, and after Hitler took power, that party swelled up with young and old men and women equally. They all hated the Jews, with no exception. It was a very devastating era. So this building has a significant part. Later on, this building actually was part of the Budapest ghetto. So we were somewhat privileged and was better suited for being safe. My father was taken to forced labor camp. What is a forced labor camp? Jews were rounded up, taken to various factories when they were working for the Hungarian military and the German military, and they were not getting any paid. There was no any recognition. They barely get any food. There was almost no facilities when they would be able to sleep. It was impossible to survive. And thousands of Jews died in those conditions. He was able to come home periodically, but most of the time my mother was a single mother trying to make a living, not only supporting me, but also my father's parents who were living with us in a two-room apartment in this building. Now, who took care of the children? The people who were residents of this building were basically responsible to looking after all of us. We were basically housed in what I call a dungeon. It was a basement or a cellar, what you would call, which was held for storage heating material. We were heating the apartments with either coal or wood. It had wet clay flooring. It had one light bulb, I never forget that. There was a couple of small windows for ventilation. And it was truly a dungeon. We never did starve. We were received one meal a day. There were times when we did get two. The food was provided by the Jewish agency, which was within this neighborhood. And sometimes the kitchen of the kindergarten was used for cooking very, very simple food. And I never could have said, then I don't like something. Whatever was put in front of us, we just ate it. And we were grateful whatever we had. The significant part in my life occurred in the fall of 1943. I was held back in school because I was born in October. My mother enrolled me, and the school was about 2 blocks away from this building. And the next slide will show you the building. It was a school at the time, and it is still a school today. This building looks identical. I was back in 3 years ago, and it didn't look any different. So my mother took me to school, dressed me up, put a backpack on me, and took me to school. After a few weeks, she said, Andy, you can walk to the school. It's only a couple of blocks away. I just like to remind you that in my time, automobiles were very scarce. Basic transportation for humans were streetcars or buses. Every now and then you could see a taxi, and all other material which were basically was held by horse and buggies and similar kind of a transportation. Okay. So the two streets had no difficulty for me to cross. So when I went to school on my own, after a few days, I have noticed that people were saying all kinds of nasty slogans. Death to the Jews. They should be killed. They don't belong to society. They are detriment for our life. They physically and verbally abused me. Now I was a 7-year-old kid, was trying to go to first grade. Why this has happened? I tell you why. Because I'm a Jew. The Hungarian Nazis were very brutal. They made every effort to abuse Jews continuously. So I told my mother I cannot go to school any longer. So she kept me home. And every now and then, when she was capable, took me to school and picked me up. It was a devastating sight, but that's what it was. By end of 1943, practically all schools were closed because a war effort was going on. Everybody already knew that the Soviets were fighting from the east, the Allied forces were coming from the west. Now, my father was able to come home from forced labor camp in the beginning of 1944. And he, with my mother, decided to look for relatives for outside of the 7th district, as well as the periphery of the city of Budapest, and get them to move into our 2-room apartments. About a dozen members of the family were gathered together there. Thanks God, because all of us were saved. Because of the building, what I showed you earlier, which became eventually the part of the ghetto. But my father disappeared by end of February of 1944. And then when I asked my mother, as usually I did, what's happened with Dad? And she just said, well, Daddy had to go to work for the military, and hopefully he will be able to come home. I knew that she was just covering up. It just was my gut feeling. And unfortunately, I didn't see my father for a long, long time. Now, for a moment, I like to just talk about history. Between the relationship to Hungarian government and Nazi German government deteriorated very rapidly by 1944. And Hitler ran out of patience. Then the Hungarians didn't do what they made a commitment to round up all the Jews of the country and deport them to the various concentration camps, death camps. Hitler made a decision to occupy the country. Now, in related to the population of the country, there were between 8 and 9 million was the population, and about 650,000 of them were Jews. It was very heavily populated by Catholics all around the country. It was affiliated with the Vatican. So for a moment, I like to just stop history and go to current times, and go to the next slide, please. In March of 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary, I have seen with my naked eye the SS marching in the city of Budapest, particularly in the past side. There was a beautiful wide boulevard called the Ring Road. These people marching in black boots, in goose steps. Guess what? They were wearing that same symbol I pointed out to you earlier as an armband with a swastika on it. It was a devastating sight. My grandfather took me out to that boulevard. We stayed there for a short time, and I was hearing tens of thousands of people on the sidewalk were screaming and welcoming the Nazis. And so my grandfather took me back to the house where we lived. And he said, Andy, our life as Jews will change. I didn't understand the words, but what I have seen on the boulevard marching, I never forget it. I still remember it. It is 75 years later. Now, what happened in the United States in 2017? And I show you the next slide. I came home from work, turned the television on, and listening to the news. And this picture came in front of me. Charlottesville, Virginia, a bunch of hoodlums, thugs, good for nothing, so-called human beings, were marching. And guess what? They were saying the same slogans. Death to the Jews. They don't belong to our society. They detriment. And they were wearing the same armband what the Nazis were in 1944 or earlier in Germany. These people are detriment to not only our society, our Constitution, and our being as a United States citizens. That symbol, what you see, it represents two things. One is hate or creating hate, and two, killing, nothing else. That's the only purpose in that symbol. Unfortunately, we see that more often than not in today's society. So I would like to ask you to make a commitment. Never use the word hate, period. Wipe it out of the vocabulary. The English language is rich enough to able to express your displeasure in many other ways. And I like to suggest to replace that four-letter word with another four-letter word. It's called love, L-O-V-E. Why? Because it represents trust, respect, care, honor, compromise, outreach, stability. These words have significant meaning. And if we live by these words, we will be always successful. We always will be able to, the greatest country in the world, and produce miracles. So please, don't ever use the word hate and think about love and its meaning. Now let's go back to 1944. Shortly after, please go to the next slide. After the German occupation of Hungary, Hitler dispatched what I call a master killer, Adolf Eichman. He came to Hungary for one purpose: to deport and exterminate all the 650,000 Jews. Unfortunately, he was quite successful. Between April and August of 1944, he managed to deport over 550,000 Jews, and the majority of them ended up in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Just as a note, Birkenau and Auschwitz is two different times, side by side. Birkenau was basically a concentration camp, and Auschwitz was the death camp. He rounded up the Jews, took them to collection places. They provided some administrative paperwork to record what they do to the Jews, and shipped them by train to the various death camps. The next slide is going to show you a devastating picture. All these dots, doesn't matter what the colors are and the sizes, they all represented various kinds of concentration camps and death camps in Europe. This is the European map. The most well-known, obviously, is Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Lublin, Majdanek. They were all east of Hungary. The south of Hungary, it was in Austria, Mauthausen, as you can see. And on the west, in Germany, was Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. These were the well-known ones. But you can see all that. And after the war, there were many other camps were discovered. Now, the next slide is very precious, personal one to me. Here's a picture of my parents, which was taken in 1940 in the village where my mother grew up. I was 4 years old. But on the right-hand side, you will see a picture which was taken in some concentration camps. The far right, the gentleman, what you see, it is my father with a hat, with the glasses. They just have probably arrived to one of the concentration camps because he still wore the civilian uniform. Now, the next couple of slides just will tell you what happened with the Hungarian Jews and the deportation and other activities. This particular cattle car, some people refer to it as freight car, actually is displayed in Auschwitz-Birkenau as a reminder how Jews were transported from various places to their death. The Nazis slaughtered them. Almost every German company used Jews as slave laborers. Now, the next slide will tell you a little bit about what happened with the Jews. And this is how the Jews arrived at the Auschwitz-Birkenau. They were embarked from the cattle cars where they were packed in like sardines, no water, no facility, no food. They were transported from the various places in Hungary as well as in Europe to their death, sometimes 2-3 days or even longer. By the time they arrived, many of them were dead. Many people in these cattle cars were keeping warm with dead bodies. A horrible sight. Now, when you are looking at the left-hand side, when they arrived, all the Jews were lined up and went through a selection process. Able-bodied people put into one group. Women, children, elderly, handicapped were put into other one. The third group is not shown in this picture. They were selected by a bunch of so-called physicians, including Joseph Mengele, which Professor Gaze actually referred to select us for medical experiments, not only with twins, but generally speaking. The people who were able to do forced labor, they were taken away, given a uniform. The people who were not capable of doing work, they immediately taken to large rooms. They made them to strip down, shoved them in there, and told them, you are taking a shower. When the gates were closed, from the shower heads, no water, but cyanide gas were coming out. Devastating death to the people who were locked up. When they all were dead, the people who were taken to forced labor, they had to move the dead bodies into the crematoriums to burn them. And on the right-hand side, you will see a pile of human ashes. So some of the people who arrived to Auschwitz-Birkenau in less than 8 hours were part of that pile. This is what the Nazis did to the Jews. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 1.2 million who were slaughtered in a brutal way. Now let's go back to Budapest and Hungary. The next slide will show you. Can you get rid of that black line? Anyway, the Hungarian government issued a law that every Jew must wear a yellow star and call them the Jewish badge. It occurred in April 5th of 1944. So I wore one in my outer garment on the left-hand side. It was a requirement. And God forbid, you didn't do that. If you were caught, you practically shot on sight. The only bright side during the summer of 1944 occurred, and please go to the next slide. The Swedish government dispatched Raul Wallenberg, a diplomat, to look after Swedish property in the country of Hungary. And when he arrived, he recognized what the Nazis are doing to the Hungarian Jews. And he made a commitment that I will do everything in my power to save as many Jews as possible. And he was successful to able to save over 80,000 Jews. He issued all kinds of Swedish documents to protect some of the Jews, created safe houses. He worked with various embassy personnel in various embassies who were sympathetic with his cause to help them, the Jews, escape the country. He was a great humanitarian. Practically every major city in Europe have some kind of a statue, streets named to honoring his bravery. Fast forward, when the war ended in July 1945, he was captured by the Soviets. They tricked him. And they accused him as a CIA spy. And from then on, we never have heard about him. More likely, he died in the Gulag in a very difficult circumstances. The next slide, please. It will show a collage of pictures of the streets of Budapest. You can see the Jews were rounded up. They were wearing the yellow stars. The building was labeled as Jewish. You can see the cattle cars where Jews were crammed in there. And this is what the sites started from April to August. And that was Adolf Eichmann's mission. By the time end of August came along, the Hungarian government also issued additional laws. And of course, Miklos Horthy already was disposed, and there was a Nazi government in Hungary under leadership of somebody called Szálasi. He eventually, after the war, was hung for his doings against the Jews. The next slide will show you actually the Budapest ghetto. Okay, this is about 74 acres. It's a very small territory. All the streets were blockaded with about 7-8 foot brick walls. There were only 4 gates existed to this one where you could enter or exit. Of course, there were guards inside and outside of the gates. Nobody was able to go in and out. Now, if you can move the cursor to the right-hand side, to the right, and go down a little bit more to the right, a little more to the right, now go south to the black cross. This is the building, no, to the black cross, that one. That is the building we lived in there. This is what I showed you earlier. So we were part of the Budapest ghetto area at the beginning. So we didn't have to move because the Hungarian government said all the Jews of the city of Budapest must move into the small territory. There were over 80,000 Jews were crammed in there. And the non-Jews were asked to leave this territory. It was a very small area. Now, the next couple of slides will show you actually what the wall and the gate look like. The next slide will show you a makeshift gate. You can see it is labeled as ghetto, and there was the yellow star. There was a guard there, and people behind that, they were mingling and were trying to just learn what's going on outside of that territory. The next slide actually will show you what the walls look like, which barricaded the ghetto. We were completely isolated. You look at how tall it was. They were over 8 feet tall. This wall was discovered in 1962 under urban renewal and was taken down. But these were the walls. We were isolated. We heard nothing from the outside world. Even though we had a radio, but the Nazis, the Hungarians, and the Germans were continuously jammed the wavelengths. Now I will describe to you three instances what happened in the ghetto, which is significant to my life. We children were allowed to play in the courtyard of the building, which was a very beautiful courtyard, had about a half a dozen beautiful trees. We were running around when we had a chance under strict supervision. We never were allowed to leave the building whatsoever. How we were playing in a day could have been end of September. I have fallen, hit my head. It started to bleed very badly. My mother panicked, but my kindergarten teacher called Rose, said to my mother, Clara, I will take care of Andy. Removed the yellow star from my outer garment, while people were trying to patch up my head with the first aid the kindergarten had. And then she said, Andy, you hold my hand as strong as you can, keep your mouth shut, and look down on the street. And we walked out of the building, and I was petrified. I was told not to go out of the building. I must wear the yellow star. Neither of them happened. And we walked to the nearest gate. And when we arrived there, the guard, the Hungarian Nazi, yelled at her, that thug, show me your ID. So she did. And then he yelled at her again, well, you are not a Jew. You know, you don't belong to the ghetto. This was for the Jews, to able to round them up, take them to collection places, and ship them to Zedat. They carried a conversation, and she was saying, well, I'm a single mother. I lost my husband. And can you see, my son's head is bleeding, and I'm taking him to the hospital. Eventually, the guard let us out. And we ended up in a hospital about 8 blocks away. I was patched up. And on the way back, the guard outside were doing the same thing. Eventually get back to the building. Everybody was obviously very happy. Then we survived this very dangerous trip. The significance of the story is this. Here was a lady who never was married. He was a devoted religious Catholic. He understood humanity, what was going on. And she was willing to sacrifice her life to save this Jewish boy who is now 84 years old and talking to you. When I went back to Hungary after being in the United States for over a dozen years, she was the first person to look up. I hugged her, kissed her, and I said, there are no words in my vocabulary to thank you for saving my life. The second story could have been taken place in the end of October, beginning of November of 1944. The thugs, the Hungarian thugs from the Arrow Cross Party, they were coming into our building and all buildings in a ghetto, harassing verbally and physically the Jews. I have seen it with my naked eye. Then my mother, Rose, and other people who lived in a building were put to the wall, facing the wall with hands up. These thugs had guns. They could kill. Thanks God, it was more abuse than anything else. But they came early in the morning and took everybody away whom they could find, except the children. And how they arrived to this collection area, they were standing in line. They knew what life is going to bring them, because all the rumors were saying that the Jews are deported to various death camps. But my grandmother from the village noticed that SS guard, and she dashed up to him and started to talk in this strange, difficult German dialect, Schwab. And SS guard was stunned, became speechless. And after pausing for a second or two, he said, you are not a Jew. Anybody who speaks this dialect cannot be a Jew. You don't belong here. That's for the Jews. We take them to their death. Go home. Well, my grandmother had the presence and stability of thinking. And she said, my cousins and my sisters are standing in line. They came up from the village. Hopefully, the city of Budapest will be safer than where we lived. And after the SS guard paused and said, take your family and go home. So all the adults who were taken away from the building were able to come back. As a note, my grandmother had no sisters and had no cousins. The people whom she saved with her strength, they were all residents of the building. The third story could have been sometimes in the middle of December. Things were already calming down. We were not hearing the bombardment and the airplane flying over, the continuous gunshot. I have seen then the searchlights were looking for airplanes and at night, because I sneaked up from the dungeon area to the ground floor. We didn't know exactly what's going on. We also knew that the Soviets were coming from the east and the Allied forces coming from the west. These thugs, hoodlums, Hungarian Nazis were coming in and took everybody away again, but in a late afternoon. How they were standing in line again, everybody knew what life is going to bring them. But it got dark very quickly. And the last speaker came on and said, we cannot process everybody. And so he's not processed. Go home. We will come and get you tomorrow. Thanks God. Of course, tomorrow came, but these thugs never came back to the building. And slowly but surely, things quieted down, and how we turned in January 1945. Things changed drastically. On the 17th of January, 1945, excuse me, two Husky military personnel came into the building. They looked different. They spoke a very strange language. See, most Hungarians spoke German because of the Hungarian-Austrian Empire. They taught at school. They looked big with different uniform, but their body language said, "You are liberated." The Budapest ghetto was liberated on January 17th of 1945. Hungary was liberated by the Soviets by end of February of 1945. So now what are we going to do? My grandmother from the village said, I will walk back to that 8 miles and see if my home and my store, she had a general store, survived the war. So she walked back. And when she arrived, one of her neighbors noticed her, came out of her house, hugged her, kissed her, and welcomed her. Had a conversation. And then she was telling a terrifying story. See, my grandmother has a stray dog. And please go to the next slide. This is the dog. On the right-hand side, you will see my cousin, who is 2 years older than I am. Currently, he lives in Stockholm, Sweden. And that little guy is me. So the neighbor was telling the dog came around often to look for life and food. And she said, I fed the dog every time when I did see the dog. And then she was telling the other neighbor of my grandmother, who was a Nazi sympathizer, had noticed the dog ended the war. And then went back to his house, took his gun, came out, and killed the dog. And when a friendly neighbor said, what did you do that for? And I tell you something which is hard to believe. He said, it belonged to a Jew. It must die. This is what hatred causes. That's the reason I told you, don't ever even use it. It's a devastating word. It caused all the evil in the past, caused all the evil today, and will cause all the evil in the future. Just to tell you the evil, what hate causes. In January 6th of 2021, I was watching that unusual event in Washington, D.C., and how those thugs, white supremacists, hoodlums, were attacking our capital. I have seen somebody was wearing a shirt, Camp Auschwitz. It didn't go out of history. It's still with us, that kind of anti-Semitism and hatred to people. Blacks, Asian Americans, Muslims, you name it. We're living in different times. That particular thing really showing you what hatred can cause. So then my grandmother noticed that her home is okay, her store is okay. She walked back the 8 miles and took myself and my cousin back to the village, because our apartment, what we lived in there, was hit by bombs and we have really no place to live. So the next slide will show you my second grade class picture with my homeroom teacher. The school was actually housed in a Catholic church. There were nuns, priests who were teaching us with some secular people. But we kids were able to run around and play. Everybody knew I am a Jew. There were all the Jewish kids were there. We just had fun. And that's how it should be. Because believe it or not, we are created equal. The only thing is different between me and you, then we have different skills which was given to us. And it is our obligation and commitment to ourselves and to our families to use those skills to excel the best way we know how. So now, my cousin and I, we stayed with my grandmother. The school lasted about 8 weeks. My mother came visited us frequently. And she came home, she came to visit me in June of 1945. And she said, Andy, I'm going to take you home. Our apartment has rebuilt and you need to help me at home. As a 7, 8-year-old kid, she taught me how to cook. She taught me how to clean the house. That was my job. It was summertime. She had to go to work. Now, what happened with my father? I wouldn't dare to ask my mother. But in the beginning of July of 1945, the same Rose who saved my life was screaming top of her lungs my mother's name, Clara, Clara, Clara. So we dashed to the top floor in the corridor. And then she said, your husband Steve is home. It took me for a while to register the words. And I dashed down from the top floor to the ground floor faster than any rocket ever could move. I hugged the man who was standing there. I kissed him. I was crying. And then I took 3 steps. You wouldn't believe what I tell you. I did not recognize my father. He may have weighed 70 pounds, skin and bone. He was destroyed every which way you could imagine, physically, emotionally, mentally, socially. It was a devastating sight. It took my mother over a year to nourish him back to being a human being again. During that period of time, many nights, he was screaming, he was crying. And my mother told me, Andy, just leave Daddy alone. He was reliving the horrors of the concentration camps and the death camp of Mauthausen, which he survived. My cousin Tom, whom I showed it to you, his father actually died in his hands. He accidentally bumped into him after the American liberated the camp. But from starvation, he died. My father didn't have a chance to find him food. After the war, there were many, many Jews died because of starvation and the difficulties to trying to cope with a new life. The Hungarian government was trying to establish itself. There were changes periodically. There were more governments than you can count on your hand. By end of 1949, the socialists took power. And it was somewhat bearable. But by 1950, the Communist Party, which was even though led by Hungarians, were representing Soviet communism. They took over. That was a brutal system. The Soviets killed thousands of Hungarians, and of course, Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, slaughtered millions of his own people. He was a brutal man. He wasn't as brutal as Hitler, but came very close. We had no freedom of any kind. You wouldn't dare a word because accidentally you said the wrong word. You could end up in jail at best, or in some camp, or actually get killed. Life was miserable. I went to high school from 1951 to 55. The conditions in those years were very, very hard. My father had a business. The communists confiscated his license and his business. He had a difficult time to finding a job, able to make a living, to put food on the table for us and for his parents. There was no compensation of any kind. They were petrified of doing anything which possibly could jeopardize their life. Everybody knew that I'm a Jew. I went to school, and in my senior year in high school, I applied to university. And I was rejected by the government. The state wrote me a letter. You are an undesirable person. I had 3 strikes against me. The number 1 strike, it shows you my birth certificate. And please go to the next slide. This is my original birth certificate. You will see in the 4th column, which is a white column, says my name, underneath my sex, and underneath the abbreviation or religion. The next slide actually will show you the translation of my birth certificate. And you can see under it says birth certificate on the 3rd line in the middle, my name, sex, and religion. And it described about my parents and when we actually lived. Now, the second one, my father was labeled as a capitalist. He owned a business, even though it was taken away from him. He was accused that he is using other people of making a living. My father paid well the people who worked for him. He only had maybe a dozen people, a small business. But he lost everything because of the communists. And thirdly, we were very poor. We had no connections to trying to get me into university. So I enrolled in a trade school to trying to learn something, to be able to make a living in the future and hopefully have a family. But by the time the summer of 1956 came along, the Hungarian people at large were unhappy, unsatisfied what the communist system was bringing to them. And the unofficial political leaders, intellectuals, academia, students, we all get together and trying to form some kind of a structure and called for the demonstration and a march, which occurred on October 23rd of 1956. I was 20 years old, not quite, a week short. And I listened to the speeches. I understood what was going on. And after, when the speeches were over, the leader said, we will march to the radio station and we will read like a white paper, a declaration, what the Hungarian wants for the future, for everyone. And how we were marching happened to be, I was in the front line to getting to the radio station. And when we arrived there were two guards there. And of course, they didn't let anybody in. And that was the first time a gunshot was heard. We started the very famous historical event called the Hungarian Revolution of October 1956. Prior to the revolution, you could see Soviet soldiers walking in pairs all over the city. But when the revolution broke out, they all disappeared to the periphery of the city. And on October 31st, on my 20th birthday, I was able to leave the building I lived in there and breathe free, fresh air and hoping then we will have freedom. It didn't last that too long. On November 23rd of 1956, the Soviets with tanks, armored vehicles, with thousands of troops, came back to the city from the periphery, destroyed everything in sight. And on that day, I told my parents, I have no future in this country. By the way, by that time, we have heard that tens of thousands of Hungarians escaped the country, and most of them ended up in Austria, and particularly in its capital city, Vienna. And I said, we survived the Nazis. We barely survived Soviet communism. When we had difficulty from day to day to survive, I have no future. And with an overcoat, with no knowledge of other language, I spoke a little Russian, no money. I kissed goodbye to my parents and my little sister and my grandparents, and I left. It took me over 3 weeks to go from my home in Budapest, from the 7th district, to Vienna, Austria. And that would be another story to tell you, which would take at least an hour, hour and a half. But when I arrived to Vienna, I was able to get and stand in line early at 4 o'clock in the morning at the American embassy. And when embassy door opened, the gatekeeper let me in. And I pleaded my case. Of course, they were all prepared for Hungarian refugees. And they declared me as a Hungarian refugee of the revolution. I was able to get all the documents required to be able to come to the United States of America. Temporarily, we were housed and fed by the Austrian people, and we were well kept. And just before Christmas of 1956, we were designated to go to a railroad station, and we were taken to Bremenhaven, Germany, the largest seaport in Europe, and we embarked on a Navy transfer ship. And please go to the next slide. It was a 40,000 ton ship. It was relatively small. It was able to carry over 3,000 troops during Second World War, which participated in the Korean War. There were over 3,000 Hungarian refugees there. Young, old, Catholics, Jews, what have you. You can see me there in the red circle with some fellows I met on the ship and became sort of good acquaintances. The sea was very brutal, 40, 50 feet of waves, but we managed because I wasn't sick. I never got seasick. I was able to work on the ship to assist the staff, as well as able to go to the top deck. And the only thing I was able to see there, water everywhere, and of course, not a drop to drink. That was Chaucer, a British poet, wrote in his Ancient Mariner. I have seen ships coming to east and west, describing to the last day of the 7-day trip, and how we were getting closer to the United States of America. I didn't know where we are going to land, but I noticed in a snowy, cloudy day, a statue. I recognized it from my history lessons. It was a Statue of Liberty. I started to cry, and the people around me said, "What the heck are you crying about?" I said, "You see that statue?" He says, "No big deal, it's a statue." I said, "No, it is a Statue of Liberty." And please go to the next slide, and I hope it will not be covered up. This statue represents freedom, freedom of choice, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and all the freedom what we have. You and I have it. We exercise our right. And here is a plaque on the statue. The a poem was written by Emma Lazarus, a Jewish lady who lived from 1849 to 1887. It says, "Give me you tired, you're poor, your whole masses yearning to breathe free, to wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest toast to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Everybody wants to come to the United States because we are the greatest country in the world. We have freedom, and we practice our freedom, and we have an obligation to speak up and do the right thing. We are all immigrants, with no exception. There is only a very small minority of the people who are natives. We all came for a better life. And since I have only a couple of more minutes, just quickly go to the next couple of slides. The next slide is show you basically me, significant part on the right side. At age 75, I trained for 4 months to participate in a sport car triathlon, swimming, riding the bike, and running. And I did that actually under 2 hours and 10 minutes. So you can achieve anything in the world. I got 10 minutes off from that time because I was in the last group to go to swim in a lake. Half a mile swimming, 12 miles bike riding, and 5 kilometers of running, or 3.1 miles. You can achieve anything in the world. Set your goals high to the stratosphere. It's your willpower, your hard work, your smart work will carry you to the goal. The next slide will basically talking to you about my family. On the left-hand side, you can see me In front of me, my cousin Susan and my wife, and my cousin's two children, and Leslie's wife. On the right-hand side, you will see in the top part, which was taken in Tel Aviv, Israel. We were visiting a very dear friend. And then the bottom part is a shopping area in Jerusalem, where I bumped into a lady who was a good friend of ours. Haven't seen her for 30 years. The next slide will tell you just basically my family. On our upper left-hand side, it is my complete family, which was taken in 2014. My son above me with his wife and his son, that was his bar mitzvah picture, and his daughter. Above my wife is my daughter, her husband, and the three children. And then you can, that little fellow with the red necktie is the same fellow what you will see on the right-hand side. He just showed up in the last couple of weeks, last couple of years, and I look like a midget next to him. In the bottom part, you will see my wife and I in Milford, Connecticut, walking on the beach on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. And the other two pictures shows when I was running competitively 5Ks in the New Haven area. I stopped that because 3 years ago, I had a massive heart attack, and I am very much grounded from competition. However, I do exercise 5 days a week, even today. It's never too late to start. It's healthy for you, not only for physically, but mentally. And the last slide will show you that I have received a certificate of appreciation for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for the work I do to educate people about the Holocaust, about the Soviet brutality, and telling you about the greatest country in the world called the United States of America. We are here to build and protect each other, and we have a responsibility to never forget and keep remembering what happened those years from 1933 to 1960. And thank you very much for listening to me and inviting me, and it was a pleasure and an honor.
Thanks to our speaker. That was just an incredible story. And we have some questions, and we'd love for our participants to submit any questions to me through the chat box, and in any form. I mean, the chat box is probably the best, and then we'll kind of collect them. So we can start with
Marie,
that.
if you would read it up, I appreciate that.
I'll read the questions to you as they come. So one question that someone submitted was, what advice can you give to victims of racism when they have grown tired?
The most important thing I can tell you is education. We have an obligation to educate our fellow human beings. Some of us are better educated than others, and we have that obligation to enlighten them what's really happening. Okay, I don't want to say growing up, but I went to school in the South. I went to school in East Tennessee. I graduated from Tusculum University in Greenville, Tennessee. I had a great deal of learning, but I was able to associate childhood and growing up what was going in the United States. And so education is the most important tool we have. And the fact is, how I said that we cannot be a bystander. We have to be an upstander. We have to speak up every time if you see something is wrong. This is a process of education and enlightenment. So the only thing I can tell you, the more we are involved in our society, in our community, in our churches, synagogues, in the various groups, to provide quality knowledge and making it sure that it is clearly understood. Okay, Today, unfortunately, even in the COVID-19, there are a bunch of people who says, I'm not going to take the vaccine. Why? Because they are not well educated. We have to educate them how important it is, because it saves life. And by speaking and working hard with fellow human beings, we will be able to achieve that goal.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, another question. How do we carry the light of truth forward?
Look, number one is what we all have to have a positive attitude. See, I always tell to everybody, you keep smiling, don't groan. It takes less effort to smile than groan. So by smiling, you are projecting a positive image. And that's what we have to do. See, the glass can be half full or could be half empty. So you take that it's half full. So you have to look at the bright side of things. You have to look at the good in everything. Even things are maybe bad, but there is some good in it. And we have to find that good and use that good to go forward. And I like to quote, I love baseball, and I like to quote a very famous black pitcher from the Negro League. His name is Satchel Paige. And he said, don't look back because somebody is catching up on you. So your job and my job together to look ahead, plan ahead, creating new things. We have to remember not to forget of the past, but not to live in the past. Go forward. So this is the reason it says, then we have a gift to able to move our society and our strength in a very positive way. And that's our responsibility. Okay, I should have said something in my talk related to when I showed you that picture of Charlottesville. Afterwards, our former president made a statement. There were good people on both sides. And I have news for you. There is no good Nazi. And any one of these white supremacists, these gangs, the Proud Boys and others, they are anti-social, against our Constitution, against our society. So we have an obligation, I said, educate, positive thinking, and then move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that really resonates with me. And I try to keep positive. And there's a comment from one of our participants, Joanna, who is a professor here at Auburn as well. And she said, thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm Polish and your story was very close to my heart. My great-grandpa was taken by Germans during World War II. My great-grandma was tortured to give him away to Germans. My husband's father almost died at the age of 2 when the bomb exploded right next to him. My family has stories like yours. I came to the USA because, just like you have said, it is the land of opportunities and everything is possible. Thanks so much for your positive message.
Well, I thank you very, very much. It is really an honor to give a talk to whoever I can. I never refuse a presentation. I always work around schedules. And before COVID-19, I was traveling over 5,000 miles in the state of Connecticut to give talks to anybody who was willing to invite me. And of course, Zoom provides an opportunity that I can talk nationwide. I have given talk in North Carolina, in Florida, in Tennessee, in the state of Washington, and now in your country, and of course in the state of New York. So it's really an honor, and I appreciate your invitation.
Thank you. Are you okay to take a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay.
My time is your time.
Thank you. This question says, as my generation is the last generation to speak to live Holocaust survivors, what do you think are the most important lessons for my generation to take into the future?
Well, we must learn from history, okay? And I try to tell you that Jewish tradition has a very important part of our life, okay? And Jews believe in a couple of major things. One is what we call in Hebrew Yizkor or Zachor. It means remember. Today we remember of the slaughter of 6 million Jews and many others at the same time by the Nazi occupation and the Nazi government of Germany. The other one, you must rely on tradition. These are values, and particularly for me, is Jewish values. I need to learn from my parents, from my grandparents, and great-grandparents, and from the environment. So these values, we must cherish and work with and move forward with it. Now, being a Jew, and I'm a very proud Orthodox Jew, I try to do my very best. I'm not a black hat like a lot of people may associate Jews with that way, but it is important that Jews have now a homeland, because prior to it, they didn't. They were spread around in the world. And so at least you have an opportunity under danger to escape to. See, if somebody would ask me who I am, I will say, I was born in Budapest, Hungary. My religion is Jewish, and I am American full-heartedly over 64 years. So it's this country will have, we said that many times, not only land of opportunity, but provide you the freedom to cherish, to move forward, positive thinking, with good education. Okay, it doesn't matter, but I used to teach in a university in an evening class while I was working for IBM Corporation as a scientist. I have many students came in the evening class, they were all adults, and I encouraged them to learn as much as possible, get better skills, to move forward, get better opportunities for the future to you and to your family. And it's never too late. I said that then in age of 75, I did do a triathlon. So this is the basic message I have. In a different format, I say the same thing.
Okay. So we have some participants that are from the Hillel community here at Auburn, and they want to thank you for your story, and they appreciate your time and your willingness to continue to tell your story. So we're getting lots of messages of thank you for continuing to tell this story, and it's so important that we listen and you know, document and remember everything that happened. So we thank you so much for that.
Particularly in an educated university environment, it's important that we write things down, we document what we do. The experiments is very clearly state what we did, how we did get there, okay? Because those are the vehicles we can move forward. And also we have the obligation to reach out to the general public to provide them the necessary information so then they will be able to make good decisions.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. Yeah, we have a lot of power as educators at the university to share these truths and these stories. Are there any other comments or questions from the audience for our speaker?
Just as a comment, Ashley, I will We'll try to talk to you on the phone later on, maybe tomorrow or next week, and I will send you also an email. I like to sort of have a closure of all my presentations. So I will be in touch, and obviously you can give my contact information to your staff.
I will.
Yeah, and Dr. Grazer, it was a fascinating talk. I actually learned a tremendous amount, okay, because what you pointed out, if the general public has not a clue about it, how the biological science and medicine actually played a significant role over decades.
Thank you. I learned so much from you, and I really appreciate your being here. Thank you so much. I think, I mean, I can say what happened, but I can't convey it in the way that you can.
And there are only a limited number of Holocaust survivors who are willing to speak up. It was about 15 years ago when I decided I will put something together to start talking about it, because the little bit I can say is more than nothing. And a lot of Holocaust survivors went through horrors. Then I have a lady in my community in Stamford, Connecticut. She was part of Mengele's experiments, and she survived. She's 95 years old, okay? So I knew people who were part of the Schindler List factory and survived because of Schindler List. There were many non-Jews who made an effort to trying to save Jews. Unfortunately, there were not enough of them. And Hitler had this grandiose ideal to take over the whole world. So historically, if you go look at 1941, he practically ruled Europe, with the exception of England, Sweden, and Switzerland. All other countries were under German hands, one way or other. He had this vision to just take over and slaughter as many people as possible who didn't feel fit to his philosophy. So we need to learn history, and unfortunately, we just don't do that.
I worry about it. I think, they've done, recent surveys that really show that for the most part, our young people really aren't that aware of the history of these events and their meaning and what they mean for us today. Yeah, it worries me a lot that we will forget and sort of lose our vigilance and pay the price for that. But I guess we have to hope that people will continue to speak out and be brave.
And the important thing is that we must hope all the time. Hope is one of the most precious words beside love. That's again is a 4-letter word.
I think it's very impressive that after, everything that we've heard and everything that we know, that you still end on such a positive message.
See,
so I think that's what
do every morning when I get up. I will say, thanks God, it's a new day, it's a new challenge, a new beginning. Okay, and you never go to bed being angry. Say, you have to create common sense philosophy, how you want to live your life. Every day you accomplish something, maybe not much, but you do. And again, thank you. And I wish all of you a tremendous success in your life at the university and the community, and make sure that you get involved as much as possible.
Okay, I think we're going to come to a close, and I'm getting so many messages of thank you for coming to speak here. So I just want to share that everybody is very grateful for your time and your story, and it is so important. And we have recorded this, and so in a way, this is part of documenting history and everything that's happened. So we just want to thank you so much for your time and your message of hope and love. And yeah, thank you so much.
Take care. And Ashley, I will be in touch with you, and we will go forward that way. Thanks a lot. Be well. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Annie.
And
Thank you.
there's a post event survey that's linked in the chat if the participants would be able to fill that out. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.